November 12, 1944. The Wyoming wind carried the first hints of winter across the Brennan Ranch, where cattle had grazed for 3 generations and where the only enemies had ever been drought and wolves. But on this gray afternoon, everything changed. A military convoy rumbled up the dirt road, trailing dust that settled on the sagebrush like ash. Thomas Brennan stood on his porch, watching the trucks approach with the same stoic expression he wore when assessing storm clouds on the horizon. He had received the telegram 2 weeks earlier, brief and bureaucratic. His ranch had been selected to house German prisoners of war. Female prisoners. The War Department needed facilities away from major population centers, places where security could be maintained without causing public alarm. His 2,000 acres of isolated prairie fit their requirements perfectly. The first truck stopped near the barn, and Captain Frank Morrison stepped out, his uniform crisp despite the long journey from the processing center in Colorado. Behind him, more trucks carried supplies, construction materials for fencing, and armed guards who looked as uncomfortable with this assignment as Tom felt about receiving it. Then came the transport carrying the prisoners themselves. 23 women climbed down from the covered truck bed, blinking in the autumn sunlight. They wore remnants of gray auxiliary uniforms, some with coats too thin for Wyoming weather, others clutching small bags that contained everything they still owned in this world. Tom had expected hardness in their faces, the cold defiance of enemy soldiers. Instead, he saw exhaustion, confusion, and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Ilse Zimmerman was the first to survey their new surroundings. At 24, she had served as a communications officer in France before her capture 3 months earlier. She spoke enough English to understand the guards' basic commands, though she kept this skill carefully hidden during transport. Her eyes moved across the ranch, taking in the weathered barn, the corral where horses watched the commotion with mild interest, the distant mountains that reminded her painfully of Bavaria. This was nothing like the stark military compounds she had imagined. It looked like a working farm, alive and functional, not a prison. Helene Hoffman, barely 19 and still looking younger, stood close to Ilse, seeking unconscious protection from the older woman. She had been a nurse's assistant in a field hospital, captured when their unit was overrun during the Allied advance. The journey to America had been a blur of ships, trains, and processing centers where she understood nothing of what was being said to her. Now, standing in this vast open space under an enormous sky, she felt smaller than she ever had in her life. Captain Morrison began speaking, his voice carrying across the assembled group. Tom Brennan would provide accommodation in the converted, bunkhouse. The women would work on the ranch in exchange for their keep, under constant supervision. Standard POW protocols would be observed. As the captain spoke, Tom's mother Eleanor emerged from the main house, wiping flour from her hands. The first days at the Brennan Ranch were marked by silence and suspicion. The women had been assigned to the converted bunkhouse, a long wooden structure that had once housed seasonal ranch hands during cattle drives. Military cots lined the walls, and a pot-bellied stove squatted in the center, its warmth barely reaching the corners where cold seeped through gaps in the boards. The women organized themselves with military efficiency, creating invisible boundaries between bunks and speaking only in hushed German during the brief moments when guards were not present. They moved through their routines like ghosts, present but not truly there, their faces carefully blank. The ranch hands kept their distance as well. Jackson Riley, the head cowboy, who everyone called Jack, had clear instructions from Tom Brennan to treat the prisoners fairly, but maintain appropriate separation. Jack had spent 2 decades working cattle across Montana and Wyoming, and he prided himself on reading situations quickly. These women confused him. They were supposed to be the enemy, soldiers who had served the same regime that killed American boys overseas. Yet watching them stand in the cold morning air waiting for work assignments, he saw nothing threatening. Only young women far from home trying to survive circumstances they probably never chose. Matthew Dawson felt differently. At 26, Matt was the youngest of the regular ranch hands, and his anger sat close to the surface. His brother David had been killed at Normandy just 5 months earlier, cut down on a beach in France by German machine gun fire. The telegram had arrived in July, and Matt had carried the rage of that loss every day since. Now he was expected to work alongside German women, to share the same space, perhaps even speak to them. The thought made his jaw clench until his teeth ached. He avoided looking directly at the prisoners, afraid of what he might say or do if he allowed himself to acknowledge their humanity. Samuel Chen observed it all with the patient understanding of someone who had spent his life navigating the space between cultures. His parents had immigrated from China to work on the railroads, and Sam had grown up hearing two languages, belonging fully to neither world. He understood what it meant to be viewed with suspicion, to have your loyalty questioned simply because of where your ancestors were born. When he looked at the German women, he saw that same careful wariness in their eyes, the constant awareness of being watched and judged. The work assignments began simply. The women were given tasks that required little communication: washing dishes in the main house kitchen, hauling water, mending fence posts under supervision. They worked without complaint, their movements efficient and precise. Charlotte Vogel, whom the others called Lottie, kept a diary hidden in her bunk, writing observations each night by candlelight. She noted everything: the layout of the ranch, the personalities of their captors, the gradual shift from autumn toward winter. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in late November, 3 weeks after the women's arrival. Jack Riley had been working since dawn, repairing fence line in the north pasture, and returned to the bunkhouse kitchen with an idea that had been forming in his mind for days. He had watched the German women move through their routines with mechanical precision, never smiling, never speaking unless necessary. They reminded him of horses he had known that had been broken too hard, still obedient but with something vital damaged inside them. His grandmother back in Montana had always said that no problem existed that couldn't be helped by good food and kindness, and Jack figured it was worth testing her theory. He gathered ingredients from the ranch pantry: apples from the cold storage, flour, sugar, and the precious cinnamon that Eleanor Brennan kept in a tin above the stove. The old woman watched him with curiosity as he worked, saying nothing but nodding approval when he glanced her way. Jack had learned to bake during long winters on isolated ranches where a man either learned to cook or ate poorly. His specialty was apple cobbler, a recipe his grandmother had taught him when he was barely tall enough to see over the counter. He peeled apples with his pocket knife, the same blade he used for everything from cutting rope to trimming horse hooves, and arranged them in a deep pan with sugar and spices. The smell began to fill the main house kitchen as the cobbler baked, sweet and warm with cinnamon and butter. It drifted through open windows and across the yard to where the women were working, hanging laundry on lines stretched between posts. Frida Koch noticed it first, stopping mid-motion with a sheet in her hands. She inhaled deeply, and for a moment her carefully maintained neutral expression cracked. The scent reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen in Dresden, of Christmas markets and childhood safety. She said something in German to Ilse, who also paused, her nose lifting like a deer sensing something in the wind. When Jack carried the cobbler outside on a wooden tray, still steaming from the oven, he felt suddenly foolish. What was he doing? These were prisoners, enemy soldiers, and here he was offering them dessert like they were guests at a church social. But he had committed to the action, and Jack Riley was not a man who turned back once he had started down a path. He approached the group of women who had gathered near the clothesline, their eyes following the tray with unmistakable hunger. In his rough, simple English, slowed down so they might understand, he said the words that would later become legendary on the ranch. "Apple cobbler. Still hot. Figured you might like some." The women stared at him, then at the cobbler, then at each other. None of them moved. They had been trained not to accept anything from captors without suspicion, to maintain distance and dignity even in imprisonment. Helene was the first to step forward. At 19, she had not yet learned the hardened caution that came with age and experience. The smell of cinnamon and apples overwhelmed her training, her discipline, everything except the memory of her mother's kitchen and the aching homesickness that had lived in her chest since capture. She approached Jack with small, hesitant steps, her hands clasped in front of her like a child asking permission. He handed her a tin plate with a generous portion, and she took it with trembling fingers, whispering "Danke" so quietly he almost missed it. Then the others came forward, one by one, accepting plates of cobbler with nods and careful gratitude. They ate standing in the Wyoming afternoon, and for the first time since their arrival, something like peace settled over the yard. The Cobbler incident changed the atmosphere at the ranch in ways that surprised everyone, including Tom Brennan. He had watched the exchange from his office window, initially ready to intervene if Jack was being too familiar with the prisoners. But he saw something in that moment that made him reconsider his rigid approach to managing the camp. These women were not hardened soldiers. They were displaced people caught in circumstances beyond their control, and treating them with basic human decency did not compromise security or betray American values. It might even make the challenging situation more manageable for everyone involved. Within days, the work assignments shifted to include more collaborative tasks. The women were brought to help with the horses, creatures that required communication beyond language barriers. Frida revealed an unexpected talent with the animals. She moved among them with calm confidence, her hands gentle but firm as she brushed their coats and checked their hooves. The horses responded to her in ways they sometimes did not respond even to experienced cowboys, sensing something trustworthy in her quiet presence. Samuel Chen noticed this immediately and began working alongside her, teaching her English words for different tools and tasks while learning German terms in return. Their conversations were broken and simple, but they communicated through shared purpose and mutual respect for the animals in their care. Charlotte observed everything with her characteristic sharp attention, recording details in her hidden diary each night. She wrote about how Matt Dawson still refused to speak directly to any of the women, how he would leave a room if one entered, how his jaw tightened whenever he heard German being spoken. She also noted how Eleanor Brennan had started leaving extra food at the bunkhouse door, fresh bread and jars of preserves, that appeared without comment or acknowledgement. The old woman never spoke to the prisoners directly during these first weeks, but her actions communicated something that words could not. She had lost her husband to illness and knew what it meant to grieve, to feel displaced in a world that had changed beyond recognition. December brought snow to the Wyoming prairie, transforming the ranch into a landscape of white silence, broken only by the sound of wind and the movement of cattle seeking shelter. Inside the main house, Captain Morrison arrived with a canvas bag filled with mail that had been processed through military channels. The German women gathered in the bunkhouse as he called names, hoping to hear their own, praying for some word from the homes and families they had left behind months or even years earlier. The International Red Cross had been working to establish communication channels between prisoners and their relatives in Germany, but the system was overwhelmed and unreliable. Mail arrived sporadically, often months after being sent, if it arrived at all. Ilse Zimmerman stood near the stove, her posture straight and her face composed as Captain Morrison read through the short list of names. 3 letters total for 23 women. When her name was not called, she felt the familiar weight of disappointment settle over her like the snow outside. She had written to her parents in Munich every 2 weeks since her capture, careful letters that revealed nothing of her true circumstances or feelings, only assurances that she was alive and well. She had received no response, and each day without word made the silence more ominous. Munich had been heavily bombed. She knew this from newspapers the guards sometimes left lying around. Whole neighborhoods had been destroyed. Her parents could be dead, displaced, or simply unable to send mail through the chaos of a collapsing Germany. Helene was among the lucky 3. She received a single-page letter from her aunt in a small village near Hamburg, written in cramped handwriting that covered every available space on the paper. She read it standing by the window, her lips moving silently as she absorbed each word. Then her face crumbled and she began to cry, great heaving sobs that shook her thin shoulders. Frida moved to her side immediately, wrapping an arm around the younger woman while Ilse gently took the letter to read what had caused such anguish. The news was devastating. Helene's parents and younger brother had been killed in a bombing raid on Berlin in August. The apartment building where they lived had taken a direct hit. Her aunt had only learned of it weeks later when she made the dangerous journey to the city, searching for news of her sister's family. Charlotte received word from a cousin, but it brought little comfort. Her home in Hamburg had been destroyed during the firestorm raids. Her mother was living in a refugee center in the countryside, but her father's fate remained unknown. He had been drafted into the Volkssturm, the last desperate mobilization of old men and young boys to defend Germany's borders. No one had heard from him since October. The cousin's letter was brief and factual, but between the lines, Charlotte read desperation and hunger and the complete collapse of everything familiar. The newspapers arrived in January of 1945, brought by Reverend Henry Walsh during one of his weekly visits to provide spiritual guidance to the prisoners. He came with good intentions, believing that the women had a right to know what was happening in their homeland, as Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory. But the truth he brought was more horrific than anyone had imagined. The front pages carried photographs that would haunt the world for generations. Allied troops had begun liberating concentration camps, and the evidence of systematic atrocities was undeniable. Images showed skeletal figures in striped uniforms, mass graves, gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, and mountains of personal belongings stripped from murdered prisoners. Captain Morrison initially hesitated to allow the women access to these newspapers, concerned about how such information might affect camp security and morale. But Eleanor Brennan intervened with quiet firmness. "They have a right to know what was done in their country's name," she told her son Tom. "If we keep the truth from them, we are no better than the regime that lied to them in the first place." So the newspapers were placed in the bunkhouse common area, and the women gathered around them like witnesses to a terrible accident, unable to look away despite the horror before their eyes. Ilse read the articles aloud in German, her voice steady at first but growing more strained with each paragraph. The reports detailed camps with names that meant nothing to most of the women: Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, places where millions of Jews, political prisoners, Roma people, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime had been systematically murdered. The scale was incomprehensible, not hundreds or even thousands, but millions of human beings destroyed with industrial efficiency. Some of the women began to weep, others sat in stunned silence. A few protested that it must be propaganda, Allied lies designed to demonize Germany and justify the war. But the photographs made denial difficult. The evidence was too detailed, too consistent across multiple sources, too obviously real. Charlotte's hands shook as she held one of the newspapers. She thought about her service in Hamburg, filing reports and processing documents for Wehrmacht administrative offices. Had she been part of this machinery of death without knowing it? The forms she had typed and filed, had they been connected to these camps, to this systematic destruction of human life? She felt nauseated, dizzy with the implications of questions she had never thought to ask, while serving what she believed was her country's legitimate defense. Frida, who had operated radio equipment transmitting military communications, wondered what messages she had helped relay. Had some of her transmissions coordinated the transport of prisoners to these death camps? The guilt was crushing, made worse by the knowledge that she had never questioned, never looked beyond her immediate duties to wonder what larger purpose they served. The newspapers had created a crisis of conscience among the German women, but it was Eleanor Brennan who understood that guilt without redemption would destroy them completely. She had watched the prisoners sink into depression over the weeks following the revelations, moving through their work like hollow shells of the young women who had arrived months earlier. Eleanor had lived long enough to understand that people were not the sum of their government's sins, and that healing required more than knowledge of past wrongs. It required being shown a different path forward. She approached her son Tom with a proposal that shocked him. She wanted to invite the German women to share Thanksgiving dinner at the main ranch house table. Tom's immediate reaction was refusal. The idea seemed absurd, possibly dangerous, and certain to cause controversy if word spread to neighboring ranches or town. These were enemy prisoners of war, not dinner guests. But Eleanor was persistent in the way only mothers can be with their adult children. She reminded him that Thanksgiving was about gratitude even in difficult times, about recognizing our shared humanity across differences. She also pointed out that the women needed to see that Americans lived by the values they claimed to represent. "If we feed them like prisoners but never treat them like people," she said, "we become no better than those who ran the camps they are mourning." The announcement came 3 days before Thanksgiving. Captain Morrison had given reluctant approval after Eleanor personally guaranteed there would be no security concerns. The women would be invited in small groups to the main house, where they would share a meal with the Brennan family and the ranch hands. The invitation was presented to the prisoners during their evening roll call, and the response was stunned silence. Ilse, serving as translator, had to repeat the message twice before the women fully understood what was being offered. Several began to cry immediately, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. Others looked suspicious, wondering what would be demanded of them in return for this privilege. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and clear, with frost covering the prairie grass like scattered diamonds. Eleanor had been cooking for 2 days, preparing a feast that would feed 24 people. Tom had slaughtered one of their finest turkeys, and the bird roasted slowly in the kitchen oven, filling the house with aromas that made even the Cowboys weak with anticipation. Jack Riley had baked 3 apple cobblers, his signature contribution now eagerly anticipated by everyone on the ranch. Samuel Chen had prepared a special dish taught to him by his mother, adapting traditional flavors to available ingredients in a gesture that honored his own heritage while participating in this American tradition. The first group of women arrived at noon, escorted by guards who were instructed to remain outside. Helene, Frida, Charlotte, and 4 others stepped into the main house with visible nervousness, their hands clasped in front of them, their eyes taking in the warmth and comfort of a real home. February of 1945 brought word that repatriation procedures were being formalized for German prisoners across the United States. The war in Europe was entering its final phase, with Allied forces advancing on Berlin from both east and west. German defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. Captain Morrison received detailed instructions from the War Department, outlining the process by which prisoners would be returned to their homeland once hostilities officially ceased. He was required to inform the women at the Brennan Ranch that their captivity would soon end, that they would be free to return home within months. The announcement should have been received with joy and relief. Instead, it triggered a crisis that none of the American staff had anticipated. The women gathered in the bunkhouse after the formal announcement, and for the first time since their arrival, voices were raised in heated debate. The conversation was entirely in German, rapid and emotional, with some women arguing passionately while others sat in troubled silence. Ilse found herself at the center of the discussion, not because she sought leadership but because the others looked to her for guidance in navigating this impossible choice. "Return to what?" she asked the group, her voice carrying the weight of months spent grappling with questions that had no easy answers. "Return to cities that no longer exist, to families we cannot locate, to a country that committed unspeakable crimes in our names while we claimed ignorance?" Charlotte's diary entries from this period reveal the depth of internal conflict the women experienced. She wrote about lying awake at night, staring at the bunkhouse ceiling while wrestling with competing loyalties and fears. Part of her felt that returning to Germany was a duty, that her country needed people willing to help rebuild and atone for what had been done. But another part of her recognized that the Brennan Ranch had given her something she had never found in Germany: the freedom to question, to think independently, to become someone different than who she had been taught to be. The Americans had shown her what it meant to live without fear of expressing doubt or asking uncomfortable questions. Could she return to a culture that had punished such independence? Helene's situation was particularly heartbreaking. At 19, she had no family left to return to. The aunt who had written to inform her of her parents' death had made it clear in subsequent letters that she could barely feed herself, much less take in another mouth. Germany offered Helene nothing but memories of loss and a future of uncertainty in a devastated landscape. Yet the idea of staying in America, of choosing to remain with former enemies rather than return to help her countrymen, felt like the ultimate betrayal of her identity as a German. She spent hours each day working with the horses, finding in their quiet presence a peace that human conversation could not provide. Frida often joined her in these silent vigils, the 2 young women communicating through shared grief more than words. The ranch hands watched this unfolding crisis with their own complicated emotions. Jack Riley had grown genuinely fond of several of the women, particularly Frida, whose gift with horses had made her invaluable to ranch operations. The thought of her returning to a destroyed Germany where her talents would be wasted troubled him more than he wanted to admit. The breaking point came on a March evening when Ilse approached Tom Brennan at his office in the main house. She had been rehearsing this conversation for weeks, carefully choosing English words that would convey the complexity of what she needed to say. Captain Morrison was also present, having been summoned by Tom when he learned that Ilse had requested a formal meeting. The young German woman stood before the 2 men with her hands folded, her posture straight despite the nervousness evident in her eyes. She began speaking in careful, measured English that had improved dramatically over the months. "Mr. Brennan, "Captain Morrison, I come to speak for some of us who cannot speak so well in English. We have a request that is very unusual, but we must ask it anyway." What followed was an explanation that neither man had expected. 7 of the 23 women wanted to formally request permission to remain in the United States rather than accept repatriation to Germany. Ilse explained their reasoning with heartbreaking honesty. They had nowhere to return to, no families waiting, no homes standing. More importantly, they had discovered in Wyoming something that Germany had never offered them: the freedom to think differently, to question authority, to become individuals rather than components of a collective ideology. They wanted the chance to build new lives in America, to contribute to a society that had shown them unexpected mercy and kindness. They were prepared to work, to prove themselves worthy of this extraordinary consideration, to spend the rest of their lives earning the second chance they were requesting. Tom Brennan sat in stunned silence for a long moment after Ilse finished speaking. He had never imagined that prisoners would ask to remain in captivity rather than accept their freedom. Captain Morrison's expression revealed similar shock, though his military training helped him maintain composure. The legal and bureaucratic complications were staggering. These women were still technically enemy combatants, still subject to Geneva Convention protocols that mandated repatriation. There was no established process for what they were requesting, no precedent to follow, no clear authority to approve such an unusual petition. Yet both men recognized the profound courage it took for these women to make such a request, knowing they risked rejection and the judgment of both Germans and Americans for their choice. The news of the women's request spread through the ranch within hours, carried by guards and ranch hands who had overheard portions of the conversation. Reactions were mixed and passionate. Matt Dawson's anger, which had been slowly diminishing over the months, flared back to life. He confronted Jack Riley in the barn, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "My brother died fighting these people, and now we are supposed to welcome them as neighbors? Give them the right to stay in our country while David is buried in a military cemetery in France? It is an insult to every American who sacrificed for this war." Jack listened without interrupting, understanding that Matt's pain was real and deserved space to be expressed. But when the younger cowboy finished, Jack responded with quiet firmness. "David died fighting evil, not fighting these particular women. He died so that people could be free to choose who they want to become. Seems to me that honoring his sacrifice means giving people that choice." 27 years after that unprecedented request in Tom Brennan's office, Ilse Zimmerman Riley stood in the Wyoming wind, her silver hair escaping from beneath a wide-brimmed hat as she watched her daughter help Jack saddle horses for the afternoon ride. The ranch had changed in the decades since the war, expanded and modernized, but the essential character remained the same. The barn, where she had first tasted apple cobbler, still stood, weathered but sturdy, a monument to the moment when kindness had begun to break through hatred. She had married Jack Riley in 1948, 3 years after the War Department approved her immigration status, making her one of 7 German women who had been allowed to remain in America under special provisions that recognized their unique circumstances. The journey from prisoner to citizen had not been easy. The women had faced suspicion from some community members, whispered accusations of being Nazi sympathizers who had escaped justice. But they had also found remarkable support from others who believed in redemption and second chances. Eleanor Brennan had lived long enough to see Ilse and Jack marry, and had held their first grandchild before passing peacefully in her sleep in 1955. Helene had become a registered nurse, working at the hospital in Cheyenne, where her gentle compassion made her beloved by patients and staff alike. Charlotte had opened a translation service, using her language skills to help other immigrants navigate American bureaucracy, paying forward the help she had received. Frida had married Samuel Chen, their union raising eyebrows in some circles, but celebrated by those who understood that love recognized no boundaries of nation or race. The women had maintained connections with those who returned to Germany, an informal network of letters that chronicled the parallel journeys of reconstruction on both sides of the Atlantic. Some who went back had found surviving family members and rebuilt lives in a transformed Germany that rejected its Nazi past and embraced democracy. Others had struggled with poverty and the stigma of having been captured, of having spent months in American custody. The letters flowing between Wyoming and Germany revealed that both paths had required courage, both choices had demanded sacrifice, and neither was inherently more noble than the other. Ilse's own story had become something of a legend in the region, the German POW who had fallen in love with a cowboy and stayed to build a life on the prairie. But she knew the real story was more complex than romance. It was about finding home not in a place or a nation, but in the freedom to choose who you wanted to become. The Brennan Ranch had given her that freedom when her own country had denied it, and she had spent decades trying to honor that gift by living with integrity, kindness, and gratitude. As she watched her daughter laugh at something Jack said, Ilse thought about the apple cobbler that had started everything, about how small gestures of humanity could cascade into transformations no one anticipated. She thought about the choice she had made in 1945, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would make it again.